Marvel has always been at its best when it leaves us with one question that refuses to disappear. Sometimes it's hidden inside a post-credit scene. Sometimes it's buried in a single line of dialogue. And sometimes it's sitting quietly on a wooden bench beside a lake. For years, fans have argued about that final moment in Avengers Endgame. We watched Steve Rogers travel back through time to return the Infinity Stones, and only seconds later, instead of reappearing on the quantum platform where everyone expected him, he was already sitting nearby as an old man, peacefully waiting for Sam Wilson. It was a beautiful ending, emotional, satisfying, a perfect farewell to the first Avenger. But now that Avengers Doomsday is approaching, that same scene suddenly feels less like an ending and more like the beginning of a mystery we may have completely overlooked. Because if Steve Rogers truly lived an entire lifetime with Peggy Carter and eventually grew old, then one impossible question refuses to go away. Why are so many rumors, theories, and story possibilities pointing toward a young Steve Rogers becoming important again? Is Marvel simply bringing back another Captain America variant from somewhere else in the multiverse, or have we misunderstood Steve's final journey all along? The deeper you look into the MCU's own rules, the stranger the answer becomes. The easiest explanation would be to assume that Marvel is simply borrowing a different Steve from another universe. After all, the multiverse saga has introduced countless alternate realities, variants, and different versions of familiar heroes. We've already seen multiple Lokis, several Spider-Men, alternate Doctor Stranges, and even different versions of Wanda Maximoff. So introducing another Steve Rogers wouldn't feel impossible anymore. But here's where things become interesting. Marvel has never treated Steve's story the same way it treated everyone else's. His farewell in Endgame wasn't designed like an open-ended goodbye. It was written as the completion of a promise that had been waiting since Captain America, the first Avenger. Everything came full circle. The dance with Peggy, the quiet life he sacrificed decades earlier, the shield passed to Sam Wilson. It all felt too intentional to simply throw away by saying, "This is just another Steve." If Marvel chooses to bring him back in Avengers Doomsday, they know audiences won't be emotionally invested in a random variant wearing the same face. They'll want the Steve who crashed into the Arctic, the Steve who stood against Hydra, the Steve who refused to sacrifice Vision until there was absolutely no other choice, the Steve who whispered, "I can do this all day." That emotional connection only exists with the original Captain America. And strangely enough, the MCU itself may have already given us a path that makes his return possible without breaking its own rules. To understand that possibility, we have to forget almost everything Hollywood has taught us about time travel. Most stories tell us that changing the past rewrites the future. The MCU deliberately rejected that idea. Bruce Banner explained it more clearly than anyone. Traveling into your past doesn't overwrite your present. Instead, your actions create a branching reality, a completely separate timeline that continues existing alongside your original one. That's why returning the Infinity Stones mattered so much. Every missing stone would have left another reality permanently damaged. Steve's mission wasn't simply to put objects back where they belonged. His mission was to prevent countless alternate universes from spiraling into chaos. By returning every stone, he repaired those branches before they became disasters. At least, that's what we all believed. But there was one decision Steve made after finishing his mission that wasn't about the stones at all. It was personal. Instead of returning immediately to his own timeline, he stayed behind with Peggy Carter. And according to the very rules Endgame established, that single decision couldn't have rewritten history. It should have created an entirely new branch of reality. The moment Steve chose love over returning home, another universe should have begun its own completely independent history. Now imagine what that actually means. We usually skip directly from Steve dancing with Peggy to an elderly Steve sitting on that bench. Roughly 70 years of his life simply disappear from the story. Marvel never showed us what happened during those decades. We don't know how history changed. We don't know whether Steve continued being Captain America in secret. We don't know how much Peggy knew about future events. We don't know whether Steve quietly prevented certain tragedies or deliberately allowed history to unfold exactly as he remembered. Those missing decades are among the biggest unexplored gaps in MCU history, and that gap becomes incredibly valuable during the multiverse saga. Marvel isn't interested in empty space inside its timeline. It loves returning years later to reveal that something important had been happening all along. Just look at how Loki transformed our understanding of time itself, or how Spider-Man: No Way Home completely redefined the consequences of earlier movies. Suddenly, forgotten moments become central pieces of a much larger puzzle. What if Steve's unseen life wasn't simply retirement? What if those 70 unseen years quietly shaped an entirely different universe whose consequences are only now beginning to collide with Earth 616? This is where one of the most fascinating theories surrounding Avengers Doomsday begins to take shape. It isn't supported by official confirmation, but it fits surprisingly well with the mechanics Marvel has already established. According to this idea, the branch Steve created eventually became the retro-futuristic universe associated with the Fantastic Four as Earth 828. Its architecture feels nostalgic, yet its scientific progress seems decades ahead of ours. It looks like history took a different path rather than simply advancing faster. That difference has always invited speculation. What event pushed that universe onto another trajectory? Was it a technological breakthrough? Was it Reed Richards? Or could the change have started much earlier with one unexpected arrival from another timeline? Steve Rogers wasn't just an ordinary traveler. He carried knowledge of future wars, alien invasions, Hydra's secrets, and humanity's greatest victories and failures. Even if he tried to live quietly, the simple existence of someone possessing decades of future knowledge could subtly reshape history without anyone realizing it. One conversation, one warning, one scientific idea shared with the right person. History doesn't always change because someone intends to rewrite it. Sometimes it changes because someone simply exists where they were never supposed to be. And that's exactly why Dr. Doom becomes such an intriguing piece of this puzzle. We already know that Avengers Doomsday places Doom at the center of a massive multiversal conflict. We know incursions, collisions between universes, are becoming one of the greatest threats facing reality itself. We know that brilliant minds like Reed Richards will almost certainly play a crucial role in understanding these cosmic disasters. But what if Doom eventually traces the origin of one catastrophic chain reaction back to a single decision made decades earlier? Not because Steve intended to destroy the multiverse, but because the branch he created continued evolving until it began intersecting with realities it was never meant to touch. In Marvel Comics, incursions don't happen because someone is evil. They happen because universes become entangled in ways that threaten both realities simultaneously. If Marvel adapts that concept for the MCU, Steve's choice to remain in another timeline suddenly gains enormous significance. A decision once celebrated as the happiest ending in MCU history could become the spark that unintentionally places entire universes in danger. And if Dr. Doom believes eliminating that source could save or control the multiverse, then Steve Rogers stops being a retired hero and becomes one of the most important individuals in existence, whether he ever wanted that responsibility again or not. The more you think about it, the more ironic Steve Rogers' story becomes. Throughout his entire life, he was the one man who constantly sacrificed his own happiness so that everyone else could have a future. He crashed the Valkyrie into the Arctic knowing he might never see Peggy again. He woke up 70 years later in a world that no longer belonged to him. He stood against his own government during the Sokovia Accords because he believed freedom was worth fighting for. He watched friends disappear, kingdoms fall, and half the universe turn to dust. Every major decision Steve ever made was about protecting someone else. Then, for the first time in his life, he finally chose something for himself. He chose a quiet life. He chose love. He chose the future he had been denied since the 1940s, and if this theory turns out to be even partially true, That single, selfless man may have unknowingly triggered the greatest multiversal crisis in Marvel history. Not because he made the wrong decision, but because even the smallest action becomes unpredictable when it happens outside its original timeline. That would be exactly the kind of tragic irony Marvel has always loved to explore. Heroes don't create disasters because they're reckless. Sometimes they create them simply by trying to be human. There's another mystery hidden inside Endgame that fans have debated for years, and strangely, it becomes much easier to explain through this perspective. Think back to the moment everyone was waiting for Steve to return. Bruce Banner activated the quantum platform. Sam Wilson watched the countdown. Bucky Barnes seemed unusually calm. Then the timer reached 0, and Steve never appeared. For a brief second, everyone assumed something had gone wrong, but Steve hadn't disappeared. He was already sitting on that nearby bench as an elderly man. At the time, most viewers accepted the emotional reveal without asking the obvious question: how did he get there? The quantum platform was established as the entry and exit point for time travel. Scott Lang, Clint Barton, Banner. Everyone used the same system. Steve should have reappeared there too. Instead, he arrived somewhere completely different, as if he had used another method entirely. Marvel never explained that detail. It simply moved on because the emotional payoff mattered more than the mechanics. Years later, though, those mechanics suddenly become impossible to ignore. One explanation is that Steve somehow returned using the quantum technology in a way we simply never saw. That's certainly possible. But there's another possibility that becomes far more interesting once Reed Richards enters the MCU. Reed isn't simply another genius on Tony Stark's level. He's often portrayed as one of the greatest scientific minds in the entire Marvel multiverse. His understanding of dimensional physics, cosmic energy, and reality itself operates on an entirely different scale. If Steve truly spent decades living inside the Fantastic Four's universe, or any advanced alternate reality shaped by Reed's discoveries, it's almost impossible to imagine that Reed would remain unaware of him. Imagine meeting a man whose DNA had been permanently altered by the super soldier serum, who possessed first-hand knowledge of alien invasions, infinity stones, alternate timelines, and the collapse of half the universe. Reed Richards wouldn't ignore someone like that. He would study the implications. Not Steve himself as a weapon, but the impossible story he represented. Steve would essentially be living proof that another universe existed beyond his own. For a scientist like Reed, that discovery wouldn't just be fascinating, it would change everything. Now imagine the conversations that could have happened during those missing decades. Steve isn't Tony Stark. He doesn't build impossible machines overnight, but he understands leadership better than almost anyone in Marvel history. Reed, on the other hand, understands science at a level few people can even comprehend. Together, they represent two completely different forms of intelligence. One understands humanity, the other understands reality itself. It's easy to picture Reed slowly uncovering the truth behind Steve's origin, eventually realizing that this quiet retired veteran isn't actually from his universe at all. If Reed reached that conclusion, he would naturally begin searching for ways to observe neighboring realities. That search could become the foundation of his multiversal technology. Not because he wanted to invade other universes, but because he wanted answers. And that's often how Marvel's greatest discoveries begin. Curiosity opens a door. Someone steps through it. Then the consequences become far larger than anyone expected. This theory also gives a completely different meaning to Reed's inevitable conflict with Dr. Doom. Traditionally, Reed and Victor Von Doom oppose each other because of science, ego, philosophy, and destiny. But imagine adding Steve Rogers to that equation. If Reed learned about the branching reality created by Steve's decision, he might see it as something to understand and protect. Doom, however, would likely see something entirely different. He would see an unstable fracture in reality, a weakness, an opportunity. Doom has never been satisfied with simply surviving catastrophic events. He wants control over them. If incursions begin destroying universes across the multiverse, Doom wouldn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. He would search for the source. He would search for leverage. And eventually, every path could lead back to the man whose choice unintentionally created one of the most significant branch realities in existence. From Doom's perspective, Steve Rogers wouldn't merely be Captain America anymore. He would be living evidence that history itself can be redirected. Someone capable of changing destiny without even realizing it. Then, another fascinating possibility emerges. What if Doom doesn't actually hate Steve? What if he needs him? That's a very different motivation. Villains often become more compelling when they aren't driven by simple revenge. If Doom believes Steve's branch timeline contains the missing piece required to stop or dominate the multiverse, capturing Steve suddenly becomes far more valuable than killing him. Marvel has already shown us that the multiverse isn't powered only by technology. Certain individuals become anchors around which reality itself begins to organize. Loki's transformation at the end of Loki Season 2 proved that one person's sacrifice can stabilize countless timelines simultaneously if one individual can hold the branches of reality together. Another individual could unknowingly become the origin point of one of those branches. Steve's decision to remain in the past may have made him exactly that, a fixed point whose existence now matters far beyond his own universe. That would explain why a conflict as enormous as Avengers Doomsday would still revolve around a man who supposedly retired years ago. His greatest battle wouldn't begin because he picked up the shield again. It would begin because reality itself refuses to let his final choice remain in the past. And perhaps the most emotional part of this entire theory isn't about Doom, Reed Richards, or incursions at all. It's about Steve himself. Imagine finally earning the peaceful life you spent decades fighting for, believing the world no longer needs you, only to discover that your happiest decision has become the center of the greatest crisis the multiverse has ever faced. Steve never wanted to be a legend. He never wanted power. He never chased glory. Every time history forced him into impossible situations, he accepted them because nobody else could. If Avengers Doomsday reveals that he must leave Peggy's world behind once again to protect every universe, it would perfectly mirror the sacrifice that defined him from the very beginning. The difference is that this time, he wouldn't just be saving one Earth. He'd be fighting for the survival of every reality connected to the choice he made decades earlier. And suddenly, that quiet old man sitting alone on a bench at the end of Endgame wouldn't represent the end of Captain America's journey at all. It would represent the calm before the most important chapter of his story ever truly began. Once you start connecting these pieces, another question naturally appears. If Steve really spent decades inside this alternate reality, then why didn't anyone from Earth 616 ever notice? Why didn't Doctor Strange sense another Captain America existing somewhere in the multiverse? Why didn't the TVA interfere? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why would Steve stay hidden for so long if he knew another universal crisis was approaching? The answer may lie in something Marvel has quietly repeated throughout the multiverse saga. Knowing that a disaster is coming doesn't always mean you can prevent it. In fact, trying to stop it too early often becomes the very thing that causes it. We've already seen this paradox play out with Kang, with He Who Remains, and with countless branching timelines inside the TVA. Every attempt to control destiny ends up creating an even greater version of the problem. Steve understands sacrifice better than anyone. If Reed Richards ever told him that crossing between universes too soon could accelerate an incursion, Steve wouldn't ignore that warning. He would do what he has always done, wait until there was absolutely no other choice. That's the difference between Steve Rogers and almost every other hero in the MCU. He never fights because he wants to. He fights because eventually there is simply no one else left to stand. That possibility also changes the way we look at the Fantastic Four's role in Avengers Doomsday. Up until now, many fans have assumed Reed Richards would simply arrive in Earth 616 as the brilliant scientist who explains the multiverse to the Avengers. But what if Reed's relationship with Earth 616 is much more personal than that? What if the first Avenger has been living in his universe for decades? Imagine Reed carrying the burden of protecting a secret that could shake the foundations of the multiverse itself. He knows Steve doesn't belong there. He knows Steve came from another reality. He knows that opening a bridge between universes could trigger consequences beyond anyone's imagination. Yet as incursions begin consuming entire worlds, the moment eventually arrives when staying hidden becomes more dangerous than revealing the truth. Reed doesn't bring Steve back because it's emotionally satisfying. He brings him back because the multiverse has reached a point where the man who unknowingly helped create one of its most important branch realities may also be the only person capable of helping save it. That would also explain something audiences have been asking ever since the Fantastic Four. First Steps was announced. Why introduce Marvel's first family right before Avengers Doomsday? Yes, they're iconic characters, and yes, Reed Richards is essential to almost every major multiversal storyline in the comics. But from a storytelling perspective, Marvel usually introduces new heroes because they solve a problem that the existing heroes can't. Tony Stark is gone. Natasha is gone. Steve Rogers has retired. The original Avengers have scattered. Earth 616 no longer has the scientific genius capable of matching Reed's understanding of cosmic physics, nor does it have the leadership that Steve once provided. By bringing Reed and Steve together, Marvel wouldn't simply be adding two beloved characters to the roster. It would be rebuilding two pillars that the Avengers have been missing ever since Endgame. One represents hope through intelligence. The other represents hope through character. And when reality itself begins collapsing, those are exactly the kinds of leaders the multiverse would need. Of course, it's important to remember that this remains a theory. Marvel hasn't confirmed that Steve created Earth 828. It hasn't confirmed that Reed helped him return. It hasn't confirmed that Dr. Doom's plans are directly connected to Steve's decision in Endgame. But the reason this idea has captured so many fans is because it doesn't ask us to ignore the MCU's rules. It actually leans on them. Every major step follows logic that Marvel itself established. Time travel creates branch realities. Branch realities continue to exist independently. Incursions threaten those realities. Reed Richards studies the multiverse. Dr. Doom seeks ultimate control over it, and Steve Rogers is the one person whose final choice created a mystery that has never been fully explained. When a theory manages to connect so many unanswered questions without contradicting the rules already on screen, it becomes more than just fan fiction. It becomes a possibility worth paying attention to. There's another emotional layer that makes this concept even stronger. Think back to everything Steve sacrificed throughout the Infinity Saga. Every victory came with a personal cost. He lost Bucky. Then he found him again, only to lose him once more. He lost Peggy. He lost Tony. He watched Natasha give her life so that everyone else could have a chance. His entire journey was defined by letting go of the people he loved. Endgame finally rewarded him with the one thing he had never been allowed to have: a normal life. If Avengers Doomsday asks Steve to leave that life behind once again, it won't just be another superhero comeback. It will complete the emotional circle of his character. Steve Rogers has never been Captain America because he carried a shield. He became Captain America because no matter how painful the choice, he always placed the lives of others before his own happiness. If the multiverse is collapsing, there is no version of Steve that would simply stay home and hope someone else fixes it. That's not who he is. It never has been. And maybe that's why that final bench scene feels so different today than it did in 2019. Back then, it looked like the closing image of an era. Today, after everything we've learned about branching timelines, incursions, variants, and the fragile structure of the multiverse, it almost feels like Marvel intentionally left one final door unlocked. Not a door that guarantees Steve's return, but one that makes his return possible without undoing the ending that fans loved. If that happens, it would be one of the smartest pieces of long-term storytelling the MCU has ever attempted. It would transform what seemed like a simple farewell into the hidden origin of an entirely new saga. Whether this theory ultimately proves true or not, one thing is undeniable. Steve Rogers' final decision in Avengers Endgame is no longer just a touching conclusion to one hero's journey. It's one of the biggest unanswered mysteries in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. And if Avengers Doomsday finally reveals what really happened during those missing decades, we may discover that the greatest battle Captain America ever fought wasn't against Red Skull, Ultron, or even Thanos. It began the moment he chose to stay with Peggy Carter, and the consequences of that one decision echoed across every universe in existence. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more cinematic MCU theories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to MovieCast. And if you'd like to help us keep creating these in-depth Marvel stories, consider supporting the channel with a $25 super thanks. It truly helps us bring even bigger cinematic breakdowns to life. Until next time, I'm Liam Harrison, and remember, sometimes the biggest Marvel secrets have been hiding in plain sight all along.